What would you do if a stranger stole the first-class seat you paid for, then laughed in your face when you asked for it back? This isn't just a story about a flight. It's about pride, dignity, and what happens when an ordinary man dares to stand his ground against someone who thought money could buy respect. Because on this flight, one arrogant millionaire believed he owned the skies. But what unfolded shocked the passengers, humiliated the airline crew, and left the millionaire exposed in a way he would never forget. And it all started with one simple word: no, David wasn't a millionaire, a celebrity, or anyone the world would recognize. He was just a hard-working man who had saved up for this trip, treating himself to a little comfort by booking a first-class ticket. For him, it wasn't about luxury, it was about finally enjoying the reward of his hard work. A quiet flight, a comfortable seat, and a rare moment where he didn't have to struggle. As he walked through the bright, bustling Phoenix airport, suitcase in hand, he felt proud. He had earned this. The long security lines, the crowded terminals, none of it mattered. Because soon, he'd be sitting back in that first-class seat, leaving the noise behind. But as David approached the gate, a strange feeling tugged at him. The flight was boarding, and he was just a few steps away from the peace he thought he'd paid for. What he didn't know was that his journey was about to turn into something far bigger than a plane ride. Because in just a few minutes, David would be staring at someone sitting in his seat, someone who believed his money gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. David stepped onto the plane, his boarding pass in hand, scanning the rows of wide leather seats. The smell of fresh coffee and the low murmur of passengers settling in filled the cabin. For a moment, he felt a rush of pride. This was his seat, his reward. But when his eyes landed on it, his smile faded. Someone was already there. A tall man in a designer suit lounged comfortably in David's seat, scrolling casually on his phone as if he owned the entire row. A glass of champagne balanced on his tray table, and he didn't even glance up when David stopped. David cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, I think you might be in my seat." The man finally looked up, and a smirk said it all. He didn't even bother to check his boarding pass. Instead, he gave David a slow, dismissive once-over, from his modest clothes to his worn leather shoes, before leaning back with a grin. "This," he said, gesturing at the seat. "I don't think so. Maybe you should check the back of the plane. First class isn't really for people like you." The words hit like a slap. Passengers nearby glanced up, sensing something brewing. But the man didn't care. He tapped at his phone again, acting as though David's presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. And in that instant, David realized this wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect. David stayed calm, but his voice carried a firmness the man didn't expect. "I paid for this seat," he said, holding up his boarding pass. "It's 2A. That's mine." The millionaire laughed under his breath, shaking his head as if it were all a joke. He waved lazily at a passing flight attendant. "Miss, can you help this gentleman? He seems confused about where he belongs." The flight attendant walked over, her polite smile tight as she glanced at David's ticket. For a second, she seemed ready to ask the man to move. But then, almost hesitating, she looked back at David. "Sir, the flight is very full. Would you mind taking another seat just for today? It would make things easier." "Easier? For who?" David felt heat rising in his chest. He had done nothing wrong. He had paid for his place, and now they were asking him to move, as if the millionaire's comfort mattered more than his dignity. Passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, eyes flicking between David and the arrogant man who still hadn't moved an inch. David's jaw tightened. "No," he said simply. "I booked 2A. I'm not moving." The millionaire let out a sharp laugh, clapping his hands once as if amused by the defiance. "Oh, this is going to be fun," he muttered. And just like that, the cabin no longer felt like a quiet plane. It felt like a stage, and everyone was waiting to see how far this battle would go. The flight attendant shifted nervously, clearly torn. The millionaire leaned back in the seat with a smug grin, convinced the matter was already settled. But David didn't raise his voice. He didn't lose control. He simply stood there, steady and unshaken. "I'm not moving," he said again, louder this time so everyone could hear. "I paid for this seat, and I'm not giving it up." The calmness in his tone made the words even sharper. There was no yelling, no anger, just quiet determination. And that, more than anything, seemed to rattle the arrogant man. The millionaire scoffed, shaking his head dramatically. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he sneered. "I don't sit in the back." "That's not an option." But David didn't flinch. He held his boarding pass up like a shield, his expression unyielding. "This is 2A. And it has my name on it. I'm not moving." The cabin grew tense. A few passengers exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. Some nodded subtly, silently rooting for David. Others pulled out their phones, sensing this was about to turn into something unforgettable. The millionaire's smirk faltered for the first time. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he believed was beneath him. And while the crew hesitated, trying to smooth things over, David's simple refusal was already shifting the balance of power. Because sometimes the quietest word carries the loudest weight. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. David stood tall in the narrow aisle, his ticket still firm in his hand. The millionaire leaned back arrogantly, arms crossed, as though daring anyone to challenge him. The flight attendant tried again, her voice tighter this time. "Sir, please, if you could just take another seat, we'll sort this out later." David shook his head slowly. "There is no later. This is my seat. And I'm not moving." That quiet defiance rippled through the cabin. Passengers leaned in, whispering, phones raised discreetly, capturing the moment. The millionaire's face reddened with frustration. His smirk was gone, replaced by something sharper, uglier. "You're making a scene," he snapped, his voice loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "You think anyone here cares about your little ticket? People like me keep this airline running. People like you should know their place." Gasps echoed. A woman in the next row shook her head in disgust. A man further back muttered, "Unbelievable." David didn't waver. He simply replied, steady as stone. "I know my place. And it's right here, in 2A. The words struck harder than any shout could. The millionaire slammed his hand on the armrest, drawing every eye in the cabin. Even the crew froze, unsure of what to do next. The atmosphere was electric, the kind of moment where everyone sensed something was about to snap. And then, just as it seemed the situation was spinning out of control, word reached the front of the plane. A supervisor was coming. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as a new figure stepped onto the plane. It was the airline supervisor, clipboard in hand, expression sharp and focused. The tension snapped into silence. Everyone knew this was the moment that would decide everything. David stood firm, his ticket ready. The millionaire didn't even glance at him, he straightened his jacket, smug confidence returning. He was certain the supervisor would side with him. After all, money and influence always did. The supervisor walked down the aisle, eyes narrowing at the sight of the two men. He reached for David's ticket first, scanning it carefully. "Seat 2A, he confirmed. Then, he turned to the millionaire. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" The cabin leaned in. Phones were recording. This was the moment. The millionaire chuckled and handed over his pass with a dramatic flair, as if this was all a waste of time. But the smile drained from his face the second the supervisor looked at it. "This isn't your seat," the supervisor said flatly. "You're assigned to 4C. Please move immediately." A hush swept over the cabin, followed by a ripple of gasps and muffled laughter. The millionaire blinked, his confidence crumbling. He tried to protest, his voice cracking with anger. "There must be some mistake, I don't sit behind anyone." But it was too late. The truth was out. The man who thought money could bend the rules had just been exposed in front of the entire plane. And as he sputtered and argued, his once commanding presence shrank under the weight of dozens of watching eyes. The supervisor's voice was calm but firm. "Sir, you will need to move to your assigned seat now. If you refuse, you will be escorted off this flight." The words hit like a hammer. Passengers shifted in their seats, watching with wide eyes. Some were trying not to laugh. Others recorded every second, eager to capture the downfall of the man who had swaggered onto the plane as though he owned it. The millionaire's face turned crimson. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. He glanced around, realizing every single eye in the cabin was fixed on him. The power he had flaunted minutes ago had completely vanished. With a furious huff, he yanked his designer bag from under the seat and stood. The champagne glass rattled on the tray as he shoved past the supervisor, storming down the aisle toward row 4. And in that moment, the cabin erupted, not in chaos, but in quiet, satisfying applause. Passengers smiled at David, some whispering, "Good for you." David didn't gloat. He didn't smile or smirk. He simply walked forward and sat down in 2A, his seat, his right, his dignity. For the first time since boarding, he could finally breathe. The fight was over. And he had won it, not with shouting or wealth, but with calm, unshakable resolve. As the plane lifted off the runway, the cabin felt lighter. The millionaire sat fuming several rows back, staring out the window with his pride shattered. His arrogance had cost him more than a seat, it had cost him his image, his control, and the respect of everyone around him. David, meanwhile, sat quietly in 2A. He wasn't smiling in triumph, nor was he seeking attention. He simply leaned back, finally able to enjoy the comfort he had worked hard for. To him, this wasn't about winning or embarrassing someone, it was about refusing to let anyone strip away what he had rightfully earned. Passengers whispered about the scene, some still shaking their heads at the entitlement they had witnessed. Others nodded toward David, admiring the strength it took to stand firm without raising his voice. Because what happened on that flight wasn't just about an airline seat. It was about dignity. It was about fairness. And it was about proving that sometimes, the most powerful word you can say is the smallest one of all, no. David's calm defiance sent a message that echoed far beyond that cabin. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy respect.